A few months ago, I saw this video by Godzilla Mendoza. In it, he has this little passing line that really left a bit of an impression on me.
I've read every issue of Amazing Spider-Man up until this run at least once.
Holy hell. All of them? You know how many Spider-Man comics there are? I mean, I was shocked. When I first got into comics, I tried getting into the old Bronze and Silver Age material, but I just kind of hated it. You know, just the general style, the storylines, the art. It was all very of its time. You know, like me personally, I rather enjoy comic books released after the year 2000, where it feels like they really had everything figured out and weren't held back by the limitation of 60s printers. But after watching Godzilla Mendoza's video, I had an epiphany. After all, why shouldn't I? If Godzilla Mendoza can do it, why can't I? I decided it's finally time for me to read every single issue of Amazing Spider-Man, so that finally my opinion can be more important than others when discussing the new movies. So here it is, the start of my journey reading through all the Spider-Man comics, which starts with Amazing Fantasy 15 all the way to Spider-Man issue 38, which are written by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, with issues 39 to 100 written by Stan Lee and drawn by John Romita. For those of you who don't know, Spider-Man first debuted in the comic book Amazing Fantasy 15, a magazine declining in sales that was on its way to cancellation. Though, Stan Lee had come up with the concept of Spider-Man months before this issue was published. His publisher had asked him for new ideas for new superheroes after the Fantastic Four was such a huge hit. And so on the drive back home, he thought about all the potential superpowers he could give this new character. He fought and fought for a while, but couldn't really come up with anything for the company's next big hit. But that is when he got home and he finally saw it. A fly. And after seeing this animal, he knew exactly what his next superhero was going to be. And that is when Stan Lee pointed his finger at the fly and said, "Spider-Man!" It's hard to talk about Amazing Fantasy 15 from a more critical standpoint. On one hand, this is it, the origin of Spider-Man that will be told over and over again until the end of time. Yes, there might be other medium and even other comics that tell it in a more modern and entertaining way, but it's hard to have that take away from the one that started it all. Unlike other superhero origin stories like the Fantastic Four, Peter Parker's brief story of how he became Spider-Man is a surprisingly emotionally impactful one. At first, Peter is your stereotypical nerd in high school that has a bit of a vendetta against his bullies and classmates. He's an extremely spiteful character who, even after getting his spider powers, is motivated by selfish desires. While reading these 12 pages, I have to admit I didn't take an immediate liking to Peter, something that's at an extreme detriment to the comic as a whole. However, it's having Peter act like this that makes the ending of the issue so impactful, with the death of his Uncle Ben and his way to be better. This is what makes him stand out of almost every other superhero at the time. So many of these characters had no nuance to them. All they did was fight crime for altruistic reasons and maybe had a handful of defining characteristics. But Peter was different. He fought out of a sense of responsibility, yes, but more importantly, guilt, giving an entirely new layer of character unseen in the Silver Age of comics and to a certain extent today. After Amazing Fantasy 15, Spider-Man became a massive hit and immediately got his own comic series, The Amazing Spider-Man. Like most comic books of the time, Amazing gives us an age-old formula. There's a new villain that's introduced in the first few pages. Spider-Man has a brief encounter with him. They're separated as Spider-Man follows his personal life before meeting back with the villain for the climax. For today's standards, having such a contrived narrative structure can make reading each issue a bit of a slog. These issues are written in a way where you're not really supposed to read them back to back in a serialized manner, but instead independently from each other, even if they do connect sometimes. What this means is that every issue must stand on its own 2 feet, and this is what Stan Lee was best at when writing his comics, particularly when it comes to the villain. The quality of each and every Spider-Man story told around this time is dictated by the quality of the villain. If a villain is lame or underwhelming, the story suffers. If a villain is unmemorable, the story suffers. If the villain was some shit like Train Joker, the story suffers. But luckily, Stan Lee was really good at making new villains. I mean, in the second issue alone, we get the Vulture, and then Dr. Octopus, and then the Lizard. Yes, they're not the same here as they will be later, but man, just look at these designs. Look at how they're conveyed in these cover arts. Let's take, for example, this issue of Justice League, of them fighting, Is that a starfish? I'm not sure.
Man, this thing looks lame as hell. There's no personality, the composition is completely out of whack, like it's just a starfish!
But now let's just look at these covers. Look at how goofy and weird they are. Look at the use of color, how they tell a story with just one image. I mean, it might not be the most in-depth story in the world, but it sure fits the 60s style. Wow, just wait until you see the Green Goblin. Only the merry Marvel madman could have dreamed him up. This type of narration is really cheesy enough to time, yes, but it gives each story its own identity, something that's carried into the comic itself. When you tear it open and start reading, you're overwhelmed with this sense of comic book magic. There's a lot of unnecessary narration, yes, but that just allows you to ponder each and every panel. Look at the expressiveness and personality of Steve Ditko's art. No two panels are similar, and no two panels convey the same message. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko use the medium of comic to its full extent to tell a story that isn't just a series of sequential events like in a movie, but something much closer to a book where we have jumps in time and descriptive text of the characters' thoughts. Yes, for today's standards, this style and story structure doesn't really hold any water when most people want a longer term, more serialized narrative, but that's what's fun about these issues. You don't need to read an exorbitant amount of comics to get a complete and satisfying narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. If I were a kid in the 60s and I picked up an issue of Spider-Man for 15 cents and got all this content that would last me like 30 minutes at least, I would be beyond satisfied.
Now, unfortunately for me, I am not a kid in the 60s, and even though these issues are cool and can be appreciated for what they are, they've also aged like milk.
The writing from a pure plot perspective is just goofy and cheesy comic book fun, but from a proper writing perspective, it's a slog. The amount of narration and monologue in this book is outrageous. So often will characters stop the plot so they can explain something that we can already tell from the artwork.
And it's not just the narration that Stan Lee struggles with, but also character writing. Being this early into the character's run, Stan Lee, and to that extent the readers, still didn't have a good grasp of who Peter Parker even was. Unlike the character you're probably familiar with, this Peter Parker is kind of an asshole. Even after Uncle Ben's death, he's still a vindictive and selfish character who mostly acts out of his own self-interest. Like how he gaslights his love interest Betty Brant, or just straight up bullies Flash Thompson, something that's blatantly frowned upon in other mediums, but here is treated like a victory. Reading this version of Spider-Man isn't only jarring because of how he'll actually be remembered as, but also because he's just not someone I like rooting for. Now, the first half dozen issues or so follow that aforementioned villain of the week formula while occasionally cutting to other parts of Peter's life. But at around issue 7, we get the introduction of Peter's very first love interest, the aforementioned Betty Brant. That's right, it's not Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane, but instead J. Jonah Jameson's assistant who first gets it on with Peter. Betty... God, I hate this character. In some of the later issues of Amazing Spider-Man, I'm like talking like way into the 80s and 90s, Betty is a decently interesting character. You know, she gets fleshed out a bit after she stops being Pete's love interest. But in these starting issues, she massively suffers from woman written by man syndrome. She's overly emotional, heavily dependent on Peter, and a bit of a bitch, honestly. She has no real personality, and there's nothing to latch onto on a more meaningful and emotional level. The most we get is in issue 11 when her brother is killed and she blames Spider-Man for it, causing Peter to feel like he can never tell her who he truly is. A point of conflict that will come up again, and again, and again, and again, until either Peter separates to focus on his next love interest, or I gouge my eyes out from reading so much teen drama. Speaking of repetition, that can be seen as Stan Lee's old reliable. Outside of the main bad guy Spider-Man faces every issue, there's always the same problems popping up all the time. Betty Brant hates Spider-Man, Aunt May is on the verge of death, Peter's grappling with his high school bullies being a bunch of assholes. The first 30 issues of the comic get painfully repetitive. That's not to say there aren't any cool moments here and there to help shake things up, like this panel where J. Jonah Jameson confesses he hates Spider-Man because he envies him, something that literally never gets brought up again, or the issue where Peter graduates high school, which is not something I expected so early on in the comic's run. Now, all this talk of Peter's early adventures inevitably takes us to issue 31, which marks the start of an entirely new era for the character and the pinnacle of Stan Lee's run on the comic book. And it all blasted off with one of the most definitive Spider-Man stories of all time, If This Be My Destiny. So far in Spider-Man, we've had artificial and arbitrary conflicts up the wazoo. Sure, seeing Spider-Man punch a robot that can magically figure out his secret identity is dumb fun, but that's really all it is. When writing fiction, the conflict of your story needs to be something that pushes the protagonist to the absolute brink of their abilities. It needs to be punishing, heartbreaking, overwhelming. This gives the story depth and, in consequence, meaning. And meaning is what gives stories the emotional power they have over us. There's really no meaning to anything that happens in these early issues, they all just exist to entertain kids in the 60s. In issue 31, we finally get the closest thing Stan Lee gives us to an actual meaningful plot with If This Be My Destiny, which is already a pretty fire title. Peter Parker starts college, but oh no, Aunt May is finally going to fucking die. What will he do? How can he possibly save his aunt when all the doctors tell him that literally nothing can be done? What emotions will this bring out of him? If This Be My Destiny is special not only because it's entertaining like the other issues before it, but more importantly, because it starts to show cracks of more meaningful stories in comic books that aren't just goofy superhero adventures. Peter goes crazy over the possible death of Aunt May. Desperately, he tries to get money to keep her alive. He tries to find a possible cure to retain the will to continue being Spider-Man. And yet, no matter what he does, nothing seems to work as his life falls apart. Betty distances herself further from him, he makes no friends in college, and his aunt is going to die. This conflict isn't just another villain of the week that's made for light-hearted entertainment. This conflict means something to Peter, and it will drive him to his absolute limit. A limit that quite literally comes crushing down on him as he fights Dr. Octopus's henchmen to get the isotope needed to cure his aunt. What a breathtaking image that will be homage to death. The debris is heavy enough, but what's really crushing him is his whole life falling apart before him. In this moment, Peter could have chosen to let it fall, just die and try again next life. But this is where we see his sheer willpower, the reason why he's Spider-Man, because no matter what the weight on his shoulders is, he'll always lift it back up and keep going. Betty might have left him and his new college life is new and scary, but he knows that no matter what conflicts come his way, he'll keep pushing forward. What a meaningful story. But now it's time to get back into the goofy shit. After this story arc, The Amazing Spider-Man went through a sort of soft reboot with Peter now in college and meeting a new supporting cast of characters. And by God, are they so much better than the previous ones. In place of Betty Brant, we have Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson as Peter's new potential love interest, which in terms of personality are quite interchangeable with each other. These two still suffer from woman written by man syndrome, but they managed to stand out. It's clear that Stan Lee wanted to capture the counterculture revolutionary spirit of 1960s youth. This leads to characters like Gwen Stacy to have so much more of her own character. She calls Peter out of this shit and chooses what to do with her life on her own terms. It's clear she has her own thoughts and feelings, unlike previous female characters. Same thing goes for other new characters like Harry Osborn, who slowly starts to form a cool friendship with Peter. It's nice. Personally, I've never liked the trope of having protagonists constantly fight with their supporting cast, and to see Peter Parker have a genuine friendship with someone is so refreshing. Not only does Spider-Man get a much stronger supporting cast, but these episodic stories get way better. For example, issues 39 to 40, How Green Was My Goblin. Wait, there's no way that's actually what it's called. Oh my god, it is. I'm sorry, how do we go from the absolute fire title that is If This Be My Destiny to How Green Was My Fucking Goblin? Okay, anyway. How Green Was My Goblin is a standout in this section, believe it or not. So far, all Spider-Man villains have been nothing more than villain of the week, just a new problem for Spidey to punch. But this issue takes it up a notch by taking the Green Goblin, whose identity was unknown until now, and cementing him as someone to be taken seriously. He follows Spider-Man home after their suspiciously brief battle and actually learns his secret identity. Already this is huge. Stan Lee has blueballed us so many times with Peter Parker's secret identity potentially being revealed. But in all those occasions, it was always a cop-out. But here, oh my god, it actually happens. A big life-changing event takes place for Peter that could screw him over big time. These two issues raise the stakes considerably for the threat these villains, and especially the Green Goblin, pose. Even after Peter barely makes it out alive from the encounter and learns that the Green Goblin is actually Norman Osborn, he can't bring himself to kill him as Osborn loses all memory of being the Goblin. He lets him go free, and for every issue going forward, you can feel the looming threat of the Green Goblin, knowing that at any moment, Norman could gain his identity back and spell doom for Spider-Man. It's a pretty cool story. After this, we just get banger issue after banger issue. Issue 41 properly introduces Mary Jane into the comic. Awesome new villains with the Rhino come in, and Peter starts to develop a genuine relationship with Gwen Stacy that feels so much more emotional than anything we've seen with Betty Brant before. Another big change at this point in Lee's run is Ditko's sudden departure from Marvel Comics over creative differences. In his place came John Romita to pencil Spider-Man from issue 39 onwards. This guy really knew what Spider-Man was about and slowly formed his art style into what most people think of when they think Silver Age Spider-Man. Away went the jankier, more cartoonish drawings reminiscent of Jack Kirby, and in its place was a more mature and realistic style. Look at these characters, they feel so much more alive and detailed. Previously, a lot of the characters were stuck in small panels that made their face look small and mushed. Now, they feel properly realized with dynamic panels that give not only the characters room to breathe, but the art to flourish. He even left his mark on the character designs. Slowly we started to see the scrawny and nerdy Peter from Ditko fade away, and in its place, Romita crafted a mature, built, and distinctively young adult Peter that fits right in with 60s youth. This also applies to new characters like Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane. Unlike Betty Brant and Liz Allen, who could just blend in with any other background character with a lack of defining traits and visual characterizations, these two new girls stand out considerably. Look at the choice of color in the clothing and hair, how Romita uses panels to make certain features stand out. Even something as simple as this can help the reader form a deeper relationship with these characters, and it's always fun seeing them pop on page. Yes, it truly seems like Spider-Man has peaked. After years of trying to find his footing as a comic, Spider-Man was comfortably in college, established a strong and lovable supporting cast of characters, and had a variety of fun villains with one big bad guy to contend with. This is peak nostalgic Spider-Man, not only for a lot of people, but also for myself personally. Unfortunately, just like Icarus flying too close to the sun or whatever, Spider-Man just had to fall. Yeah. After the high highs from early to late issue 40s, there's a sharp decline in my enjoyability of these comics, and it all starts with this one issue. Issue 50, Spider-Man No More, which you might recognize from the Spider-Man 2 film and a bunch of other places. Which, okay, I'm sorry, but this is one of the most overrated comic books I've ever read. As you might guess, the story follows Peter Parker giving up Spider-Man to do other things with his life. The problem here is that it simply makes no sense. Peter Parker stops being Spider-Man for literally no reason. The build-up to this monumental decision that will be remembered for decades is like actual 10 pages, and at no point in the previous issues is it ever insinuated that Peter wanted to throw in the towel. This isn't even the first time he gives up being Spider-Man. He did that all the way back in issue 18, except then it actually made sense. There were a ton of problems that were building up over the course of a variety of issues that hit their breaking point in number 18. A breaking point that caused him to give up temporarily before learning the meaning of responsibility for the 15th time from continuing. Outside of the initial setup of Spider-Man quitting, the rest of the story is fine. I mean, this is the debut of the Kingpin, which is kinda cool. But that's kind of it. Spider-Man No More is sadly no more than a variety of old plot points and rehashed messages. Honestly, in my opinion, the only reason this story is so well remembered to begin with is because of that fucking trash can. But what's more noteworthy of this comic is how it said a president. From this point onwards, so many Spider-Man issues rehash old plot points and have Peter Parker learn lessons that he's already learned. Grappling over the responsibility of being Spider-Man and thinking of quitting? Yep, that happened already. Grappling with the potential of Aunt May dying? Yep, we've seen this already. Relationship issues with his love interest that mostly surge from her being upset that Peter keeps magically fucking off all the time? Well, okay, the heart of these stories might be lacking, but Spider-Man is still a villain of the weak style comic, and these villains still go hard. I mean, in the first 50 issues alone, we've had total bangers like Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, Sandman, Kraven the Hunter, the Lizard, and so many others. And this second half has a ton of awesome ones too, like Kazar, and the Kangaroo, and the Spider Slayer. Yeah! Okay, to be fair, I am cherry picking here because I think it's funny. There's also tons of story arcs featuring old villains, but I feel like Stan Lee doesn't know what to do with them anymore. There's a story arc where Dr. Octopus gives Spider-Man amnesia and convinces him to commit crimes on his behalf? The fuck? Okay, there's also the first issue of Spectacular Spider-Man, which features another confrontation with the Green Goblin, hell yeah! And in this one, Norman Osborn figures out Spider-Man's secret identity. Again. And they fight while conveniently staying away from the entire supporting cast. Again. And then the Green Goblin loses his memories and becomes Norman Osborn. Again. And then Spider-Man spares him. Again. Are you starting to see a pattern? Now, this isn't to say all these stories suck. There are actually some really cool ones. Issue 90 features the death of George Stacy, which was pretty shocking in a comic that never killed off any of its main supporting cast. More so, George Stacy reveals he knew Peter was Spider-Man the entire time, which is a pretty cool plot twist. Issues 96 to 98 have Harry Osborn having a drug-induced psychosis, which is particularly noteworthy since this type of content was prohibited by the Comics Code Authority at the time. Issues like these push the bar for Spider-Man and comics as a whole, which leads us to the fabled issue 100. This is where we really see the culmination and conclusion of Stan Lee's run on the character. Now, when you think of issue 100, what do you expect? Lesser writers would come up with something predictable, another conflict with the Sinister Six, the return of the Green Goblin, the death of another loved one. No, Stan Lee was better than this. For this monumental issue, he gave Peter Parker 4 arms. Yeah! And then he has him have a bunch of metaphysical fights with his rogues gallery that don't really make any sense. And then he like recaps a bunch of plot points from previous issues. And then this comic is shit. After issue 100, Stan Lee would write an issue here and there, but none of them are particularly noteworthy. Oh, well, actually, there's one that has the debut of the mythical Morbius. Hell yeah, one of the most badass Spider-Man. Oh, wait, that issue wasn't written by Stan Lee. Never mind. It sucks that we have to end Stan Lee's fabled run on such an anticlimax, but then again, isn't that what he was all about? He was a visionary, yes, but also a great businessman. He knew that sticking to a status quo and coming up with simple and episodic narratives were the best way to reach the widest possible audience, though most of these issues have been absolutely annihilated by time. The over-exposition, the way too cartoony art style, the repetitive formula. By today's standards, these comics are like the PlayStation 2 in my garage. It's clunky, it looks like shit, but god damn it, it's a classic and it still works. Stan Lee might not have been the greatest comic book writer of all time, but he set the foundation for not only what Spider-Man comics should be, but just Marvel comics as a whole. He was the one who paved the way for other writers and artists to take his works and have them reach their full potential. If it wasn't for him, comics wouldn't be where they are now. Overall, if you're a die-hard fan of Spider-Man comics and you've already read most of like the must-read comics out there, then I'd give this one a shot. But like maybe just the good parts. You can skip all the lame ones. Moving over to the tier list, I'm gonna put Stan Lee's run squarely on the A tier. Solid run. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little retrospective on Spider-Man and Stan Lee, and I'll see you next video. Oh my god, I can't believe it! You made it to the end of the video! If you like this, then I want you to absolutely destroy that subscribe button like the Incredible Hulk. Just break it like Batman's back. And while you're there, might as well do it to the like button too, cause why not? That's gonna be about it. See ya.